isn't it? Because normally you're just looking at little icons with initials in.
Right.
Ah,
So
there you go, Richard. Thank you. Took the hint.
I'm good at taking hints.
Right. So there were a few more people registered for this, but as I said, we're going to record it so we can make it available on the website.
Okay.
So I'm going to introduce a good colleague. So Dr. David Allan, based at Edge Hill University, and not only is Dave based at Edge Hill, but he's also the editor-in-chief of the wonderful journal Prism as well. So we work quite a lot together. And so tonight, when I've kind of stopped my spiel and waffle, I'll be handing over to Dave, who's going to do a presentation on, just to remind myself, what can lesson study offer teacher education? Yes, so as I say, I'm going to zip off in a sec once I've handed over to you to get Oscar's tea out of the oven. Oh, I'm recording this, aren't I? Anyway, so
Okay.
right, over to you, Dave.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Craig. Okay. Right. Let me just share the screen so I can put this PowerPoint on. Do let me know if you can't hear me, because I'm not sure how this microphone's working. Right. Okay. So, slideshow. Right, so as Craig said, it's about lesson study. You may or may not have heard of lesson study, but by the end of this, hopefully you'll be more familiar with it, and hopefully I will have sold it to you as a strategy for teacher education. It's mostly about teacher development, so professional development for teachers, but I think it's very useful for initial teacher education, and we've been using it on our program, and obviously there are some studies around this as well. I've done some myself, and colleagues have done studies on this. So it is a growing area for teacher education, although it has come out of primary schools and secondary schools, but mostly based on teacher development. Okay, so what is it? What is it? So to give you an overview of it, before we go into the mechanics of it, of exactly how it works, I'll just talk a little bit about what it is, where it's come from. So it's a model for professional development. It's based on teachers learning on the job and developing and getting better at what they do, developing, honing their craft, if you like. And it's very much about supporting pedagogical knowledge, pedagogical content knowledge as well. But I use the term pedagogical knowledge in a wider sense because for me, it's all about, it's not just about subject and subject matter. It's about awareness of students, of pedagogical aspects of how students develop, etc., of teaching strategies, the bigger aspects of pedagogy. It's a system that requires quite intense professional collaboration. It requires teachers to work together very intensely, very collaboratively, to the point at which they're almost a little bit exposed with each other because they're having to challenge each other, challenge values, etc. And that's the strength of it. But it does require this commitment to working collaboratively. And basically, it's a system where teachers plan, they deliver, and they evaluate what they did. So it's a very simplistic process in that sense. But whilst the logistics are simple, the implications and the rewards, if you like, from this are far from simple and quite powerful. If you look at some of the literature of what teachers get from lesson study. And a lesson in itself is seen to be a research lesson. And we can talk about what research is in that sense, because obviously teachers learning on the job doesn't always equate to research as we know it, with a methodologically robust methodology and robust design for research and making a contribution to knowledge in that sense. But we can come back to that. So it's about teachers working together, and you need to form to do this. You need a team of teachers, usually 3 teachers. What I'm presenting today is a model of lesson study. It's not the fidelity to the original Japanese model is a little bit different because obviously there are cultural differences between Japan and the UK. So this is a model that tends to get a little bit, I wouldn't say diluted, because that sort of suggests that the strength of it has gone, but a little bit different, adapted in the sense of the cultural differences for the UK. So a team of teachers to work together, it's very important that they have an egalitarian approach. So if you've got an NQT can work with a head teacher, a principal of a college can work with, you know, a curriculum manager or a teaching assistant. Some teaching assistants are being used in this, but it's very much about everybody has an equal input. Everybody has a contribution to make, and everybody's valuable as valuable as the other person. So there's less of a mentoring or instructional aspect to it. And it's more about constructing knowledge together. So it's the co-construction of knowledge, and that's what I'm interested in teachers working together, as opposed to, you know, instructional coaching or a mentoring model, which operates a little bit differently. You need time to do it, because obviously you're going to tie up 3 teachers to commit to this, and they're going to plan it, deliver it, evaluate it. That's quite time consuming. So you have to be committed to this, which usually requires a sort of a whole school approach. So I'm talking about lesson study now from the teacher's perspective, using it in schools and colleges, etc. And we will go on to talk about in teacher education. I mean, I don't think you can differentiate the two so clearly. I think obviously the development of teachers is wrapped up in, you know, the teacher training and how they're set up for their careers. So we'll come on to the teacher training aspect in a minute, but just talking about the development of teachers. So it needs to be a whole school approach. It needs to have everybody on board, because it's about the cultural change, if you like, cultural shift, and getting teachers to work in this way, in this intense collaborative manner, is it requires quite a lot of commitment. So if you know, if managers aren't on board or if senior leaders aren't on board, it's quite problematic. And that doesn't mean that 3 teachers can't take this on themselves, but it's more it's a lot more difficult to do and to implement this if the culture of the school is a little bit against it. And there is a research focus, and these lessons are seen as research lessons, and we will come back to that. Okay, so how does it work? This is the mechanics of it, if you like. So this is a team of 3 teachers work together. They identify a focus. So to give you an example of that, lesson study is most often used with mathematics lessons, but it doesn't have to be. That's just where it's come from. It's come from Japan, and I'll explain that. So most of the time it's been mathematics. So we'll run with mathematics for this, but it can be used with any subject. For me, it's about the development of the teachers, but primarily it's about the development of the teacher's knowledge of the students. So a focus is identified, and that could be, for instance, the students are struggling with fractions, that having difficulty with multiplication and division with fractions, and the teachers are looking for strategies to do this. And mathematics is a good example to use, because you can find strategies there to do different things differently. I'm sure you know that lots of different ways of calculating things, and you know, percentages and stuff. There are tricks, and there are easy ways to do things, and there are hard ways to do things. And there are formulas, and there's, you know, so it's about devising a strategy to deal with the focus. That's the intended outcome, is how do we get students to learn this more effectively. So what they do is they identify case students, and these students are representative of the bigger group. And there will be 2, 3 students identified as case students, and the focus will be on those students and what they learn, and they'll be representative, as I say, of the bigger group. Collaborative planning is very important. The egalitarian approach, as I mentioned, is very important. It's important that everybody has a contribution. Now, if those 3 teachers are mathematics teachers, that's great. If they're not, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. They just have to offer something a little bit, you know, different in order to share knowledge, to share experiences, and to synthesize that knowledge and construct new meanings. So what they do once they've planned the lesson with the strategies that they're planning to do, this artifact, this lesson is then delivered. One of the teachers delivers the lesson, and the other two teachers, they observe. They don't necessarily observe the teacher because it's not like a traditional observation. What they're doing is they're observing the case students. So they zoom in on those case students and they watch what they do and how they learn, and they capture those sort of nuances, if you like, of teaching and learning. So their focus is on the students. Because it's a collaborative process, if the lesson fails or the lesson is fantastic and successful, it's a group benefit or a group sort of detriment. So if the lesson fails, it's the three teachers that are failing, not the one teacher that's delivering the lesson, because they've all planned it. That's the way it's sort of conceptualized. And then a post-lesson discussion is held. This is the evaluative part. Obviously, the aspects of that whilst they're watching, they're observing the students. But in the post-lesson discussion, you bring in the students, you bring in the other teachers. So the three teachers sit down and they debate all this, and they bring in the case students. There's also an external specialist usually, but I'll come back to that in a minute because I just want to concentrate on the teachers first of all, to talk about teachers and students together. So they meet and they have a conversation and they debate what's gone on, and the observers talk about what they've seen and how that varies from what the teacher's seen, and that conversation hopefully leads to some new knowledge. They've also got the students' perspectives, so they can get those perspectives and they can negotiate that. And between all those perspectives, what you've got is a perception, if you like, of that lesson. And in Japan, it's very much like a laboratory. Often there are lots of teachers standing around watching the lesson. So this is more of a UK model where you've got the case students and you've got the two teachers observing the case students. So in Japan, they might have the laboratory lesson where there's lots of teachers and observers from members of the public, it might be parents, it might be other teachers from other schools, and they will come in and they just watch the lesson. So this, to give you a diagrammatic representation of it, the T's are the teachers on the left-hand side, and the three teachers plan that lesson, and whilst one delivers it, the other two are observing, and they're focusing on those case students. They're not so much focusing on the rest of the students, but they're not ignoring them. But the main focus is on the case students because they're representative of what's going on in that classroom. Then we've got the post-lesson discussion, as you can see, and everybody feeds into that. So quite a simplistic process in many ways, but powerful. So it's been in Japanese schools since, well, over 100 years. Dudley says since the 1870s. A couple of other papers have said a little bit slightly different dates, but generally agree that it's around that time. It's over 100 years old. It's strong in Japanese schools. It's very much part of the Japanese culture, and the Japanese culture of working together collaboratively is quite powerful. And the difference in that in the UK is why we get sort of an adaptation of this model. So in Japan, to be humble is quite a good trait, whereas in the UK it's a little bit different, isn't it? We're sort of potentially a little bit more arrogant, but it's more about performing and be excelling in your subject and being a leader type of thing. So those cultural differences do matter. This has come to the West from so these studies, the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, were captured in a book in 1999, which I've actually got here, which is The Teaching Gap, which is quite old now, but it's still interesting. And what they've done is they've captured lesson study there, and they've they highlighted it and identified it, and then from there it's gone through the America and all lots of other countries. It's moved, as I say, to the Western world and eventually to the UK, and with the help of Peter Dudley, who's quite a key proponent of lesson study, and he's a person who's said to have introduced it to the UK. Okay, so in Japan, the lessons are very much like laboratories, a laboratory approach. So all the teachers, all the the parents, anybody who's invited to the lesson will stand around and will watch it. They might have clipboards, they might be taking notes, and they can contribute to the process of evaluation. So why do we focus on the case students? As Catherine Lewis says, a lesson is like a swiftly flowing river. I often think about this and talk to my students about this and tell them teaching is a little bit like driving down the motorway the wrong way. With the cars coming towards you and sort of having to think about your own driving, but also thinking about the driving of other people and obviously swerving to avoid them. So whilst I don't recommend that, by the way, it is to me it is similar because it's about the stimuli that you're exposed to as a teacher and the things that you have to filter out, the filtration mechanisms that you have as a teacher, and what's important and what's not important. And an experienced teacher is very good at doing this, but they're not perfect by any means, and we all miss things in teaching. So what this does is it sort of stems that flow of the river. It slows it down, it zooms in on it, focuses on these students, and these students are a microcosm of the bigger lesson. And teachers do report that it does seem to be slowing down the action. And I think it's a little bit like when you've seen a horrific incident and time's sort of gone slower for you because you're taking in far more information. And that's a little bit of what they're trying to capture here. They're trying to capture that aspect of an opportunity to capture intense information that teachers would normally miss, that they would filter out possibly. Okay. So the observers, they note down the nuances, the differences of are there any discrepancies between what the teacher sees and what we see as an observer? And sometimes things have come up with disengaged students. There's a quote which later on, but I'll tell you it now. There was one student was staring out the window, and the teacher was saying, "Oh, are you paying attention? You're not looking. Giving you an activity to do, you're not doing it." But what happened with that student was they were focusing on the activity and then processing it, and they were looking out the window and then coming back to it and processing and looking back to it. So the teacher couldn't pick up on those cues because he was far too busy with everything else going on in the lesson. But the observers honed in on that and watched the students and watched how he worked, and he was very much concentrated on the activity, but drifting off a little bit, but not drifting off from the activity, having time to process his thoughts and looking out the window and almost daydreaming a little bit, but processing it, that we often don't allow in teaching. It's like when we ask a question in a school, and then we immediately jump to tell them what we think they should say rather than giving them time to process it. So stuff like that, and there are lots more examples of that that we could talk about. So what's missing in that model so far is this external specialist, which I mentioned, but I've not really explained what the role is. It's often a university professor, but it doesn't have to be. The only reason it's usually a university professor is because they often bring to the table the literature or the knowledge of lesson study as a field, as opposed to just strategies that other teachers might bring. But it can be teachers from another institution. They could provide this objective perspective, and for me, it avoids this idea that you can create knowledge in an insular manner because you talk to teachers. I'm not disparaging teachers by any means. I don't mean this, but they say, we know our students, we know our school, we know our college, and they look upon us sometimes as an outsider because we don't know the students. And that's true. They do. They know the students far better than we do because they're obviously working with them day to day. But for me, the danger of that is that you may not know that you may need a bit more of an objective input into that. So an external specialist is very useful for this because it brings something to the table where the knowledge construction is, as I say, less insular and more validated in a way to do with what is going on in other settings or what does the literature tell us on this. In that sense, it's also an opportunity to standardize teaching. And lesson study can be used for quality assurance, to quality assure teaching and learning processes. And obviously other universities, other experiences of schools and colleges. So where the external specialist fits in is in the is in all the stages, or wherever is needed. Ideally in all the stages, but it might just be as an observer in the planning stage, and then an observer in the delivery, and then more influential in the evaluation, and certainly more influential in the next planning stage, because this would be one cycle, and they would do 2 or 3 cycles, maybe 3 cycles over a year, and that would be one iteration. So the external specialist can start to feed into that based on what they've seen and based on what they know from the literature. The external specialist might also be a subject specialist for the process. So, for instance, it could be a maths teacher from another college or another university, and it might be that they're feeding in that subject knowledge in that way. So, that don't mean to sound vague with it, but that means that there are lots of variations on this of how it's done. There isn't a concrete way to do this. There are lots of variations. External specialist, as long as they have that input, that valid input, that is either subject based or based on lesson study itself, or both even, then that's part of the validation. So in Japan, the knowledge is validated in a slightly different way, because the teachers tend to disseminate the findings, whereas unlike in the UK, teachers tend not to engage in lots of research because they just don't have the time. It'd be very unfair for teachers to be expected to, to write papers and to publish, but they've got lots of knowledge that is very valuable, and is very interesting for the teachers. And often they do publish, in networking or blogs and things like that. Well, in Japan, there's lots of dissemination of findings through more official, should we say, publications, and lots of networking. And those publishing opportunities are not just for the researchers. So, in a way, it's evidence-based teaching. You could say it's research informed as well, depending on your use of the external specialist. But you have this multi-perspectival approach where you've got all these inputs, and that they go together to synthesize new understanding, new knowledge. This co-construction of knowledge is for me, it's very important, and it's very powerful, because it's a powerful aspect that we don't get with teachers. Teachers tend to work in their little silos, and they tend to do things, operate solely and reflect on their own position and their own teaching, and then evaluate that, and then do a reflective account and write that up and reflect on that again. And that's often just on the individual. But for me, they're missing a trick, because the co-construction, the co-reflection opportunities that lesson study gives allows this enables this synthesis, which is very powerful. And also, because the learning from the practice, you've got this theory practice nexus that you can explore. You can talk about a grassroots approach where research is either research is underpinning it, or research is emanating from the practice itself. So, just looking at some of the literature, does it work? Yes, lots of very positive responses, mostly qualitative, I have to say. There are 1 or 2 quantitative studies that look at observations, etc., but they generally tend to be qualitative interviews with students, interviews with teachers. I've done this myself, some of my research, interviewing teachers, looking at teachers' perspectives, and I think that's powerful, because the teachers get a lot from this. Sometimes measuring it and looking at the impact on students' outcomes is not, for me, it's not always effective, because those outcomes may be further down the line, because lesson study is very often a long-term process. It's in Japan, people spend, teachers spend years and years on lesson study. They keep at it, and they keep improving until they get to that stage where they've saturated it, and then they go back and they start a new lesson study project. So for teachers, improved subject knowledge, improved pedagogical knowledge in relation to teaching, and for students, improved understanding of the subject and greater learning efficiency. And that systematic review in 2014 is quite good because it pulls on all those studies that highlight this, demonstrates the benefits to teachers and to students. Helps teachers to develop the eyes to see children and how they respond and learn during research lessons. I know we can't see understanding, we can't measure it in many ways, but we can infer understanding, and many of the strategies that the observers or the participants in the lesson study engage in are around inferring understanding based on the evidence that they've got from watching the students, from watching the lesson, from watching them engage with the lesson and the outcomes. It also helps teachers to adapt to their environment. So very much to do with adaptive teaching as well. Adaptive teaching is quite in vogue at the moment, isn't it? Okay. So some points that I find quite interesting. This idea of teachers as researchers. Obviously, just looking at your own practice doesn't make it a research project. It's not methodologically sound, but it can be a research project, and you've got the external specialist there to feed into that process. You can turn it into an actual research project. So it's about professional development for teachers, but also can be turned into a research project in that sense. Is research about working with teachers, or is it about enabling the teachers to learn from their practice? That's something I'm interested in. I'm just posing questions here. I'm not necessarily going to answer these questions right now. I'm just posing these to do with, because from a university perspective, we tend to go into a school and work with teachers and help them to and do a research project with them, sometimes on them. But it's not to me, it's not as powerful as when the teachers are involved and when there's the knowledge construction comes from them and we can work together. So pedagogical knowledge development, should it center on teachers or teaching? Also, this idea of the perfect lesson. Even in Japan, they're not trying to perfect the lesson. The idea isn't to get this perfect lesson. They may deliver the lesson again. They may deliver the lesson again to a different group. They may revise the lesson several times, deliver it to different groups. But the idea is not to perfect the lesson. The idea is to devise strategies and to understand students' learning more effectively. And those strategies are designed to get the most out of the students in that sense. So we finally move on to teacher training, which is why we're here. So for me, all these fantastic aspects of lesson study, of the power of it, the benefits of it, are provide an excellent grounding, if you like, for teacher training. Because if we set students up to become teachers with this approach, with this a collaborative mindset, if you like, then I think we're setting them up to be effective practitioners. So very much challenging this silo approach, very much challenging the idea that, as I said before, you learn on the job, you reflect on your lesson, you might speak to a couple of students, and you evaluate what's gone on. But for me, that's limited because you're still working within your own perspective of what's gone on, whereas you don't have the input from other people. Now, obviously, you can be observed and you can get feedback in that sense. But the difference with lesson study is you're not just being observed, you're co-constructing knowledge with your colleagues, and you're devising this lesson and you're analysing the lesson from different perspectives. Because it's a shared lesson, as I said, if something goes wrong, it goes wrong for everybody. But it's also having that shared ownership helps you to construct the knowledge together, to synthesize your or inputs. And quite powerful as well for promoting student voice. So very often, you know, the student voice is given a bit of lip service, but I think with lesson study, what you've got is you've got the students' input into the evaluations, into the post-lesson discussion, and very much about shaping teaching and learning in the future. So collaboration for me and co-construction of knowledge, that's the initial process of validation. That's where you're starting to get some feedback from your colleagues. You're starting to challenge your colleagues. You're challenging their assumptions. People, teachers come to teaching with, you know, with their values, with their assumptions, with their teaching philosophy. Sometimes we need to challenge that. As teachers, we need to challenge what we do. And if teacher trainers, if student teachers are into this process from the start, then it helps them to be a little bit more open about what they do before we get to that stage where, you know, you're an experienced teacher and you don't really like being told what to do because you're quite experienced and you're quite knowledgeable. But for me, that's limited. The strength of this is through the collaborative process. Some of the difficulties or the strengths, if you like, in this study in 2015, the collaborative approach helps to reduce that anxiety because students are often focused on, you know, what they're doing and trying to just survive. So it can help to reduce that anxiety because it spreads the load, it spreads the pressure. It's a shared ownership of the lesson. And so rather than getting up there and teaching for the first time and making an absolute mess of it, you know, that shared ownership, they can say, well, let's reconstruct that, let's do it differently. And for me as well, the teacher training offers this supportive environment where we can encourage students to engage in pedagogical knowledge construction, not just through their own practice, but through interactions with their colleagues. So I've said it's an egalitarian approach, and that's very important. But that doesn't mean that the power dynamics will never ever shift or change. And what I see is very much in these relationships is this reciprocal mentor-mentee relationship. So somebody will have a good idea and they will share it with the group, and then somebody might challenge that. So the power dynamics shift a little bit, but sometimes it might be more of a coaching model in that particular instance in that relationship. But then because it's egalitarian in overall, it shifts then. So it's one of the projects I was working on was an NQT was working with a head teacher, and the NQT, he loved it. He said, I get to tell him what to do. But that was quite powerful because it wasn't a power, you know, it wasn't to do with the power, it was to do with being empowered as opposed to disempowering the head teacher. And that was effective, I think, for that relationship. And they devised a really good lesson, and then they revised it and then evaluated it. Affords the students the tools that they need to teach rather than the finished competencies of effective teaching. And I think that's powerful as well for teacher training because it's laying a strong foundation for teaching. So as opposed to setting them up as sole practitioners and then looking to develop further down the line. So whilst most of lesson study research is usually around existing teachers, for me, it's about establishing that foundation from the outset and giving those student teachers that grounding of, you know, this is how you work collaboratively, you open yourself up, and you don't you don't respond negatively to challenge, because it's about developing. Collaborate, don't isolate. Yeah. And as I said before about the theory of teaching, yeah, we can look at how teaching is theorized. Is the underpinning theory, is it underpinning it and putting that into practice, or is the practice informing the theory? So just to give you a little idea of what some of the participants say, Collective learning. So this teacher, she put the students into groups, gave them an activity to do. But then she explained what they needed to do, and she explained it too long. She went through the process too much, and the feedback was, you just give us more time to do it, and less time to explain what it is, and don't over-explain, etc. And so these are small learning the learning steps, if you like, but they were quite powerful because they were leading on to bigger steps, and bigger understanding of how the students learn, how the students process things, how the students interact with the activities. So I'll give you a few seconds if you want to have a read of that. Okay. So this is quite powerful. I had to stop what I was doing because it clearly wasn't working. And this was later on, but this is what the teacher had been doing for quite a bit of his career, if you like. So it's about that feedback and that evaluation, the post-lesson discussion, about understanding how students learn, but understanding how they don't learn, how they disengage, how they switch off. So I think what you can see there is that in the midst of the lesson, it's very difficult to do this. What Sean calls reflection in action, isn't it? It's very difficult to do that sometimes because you're blinkered. So you've got reflection in action, reflection on action. And it's nice to look at the later on in the hindsight, but for me that's sometimes too distant from the actual event, and then your memory of the event is slightly skewed by what's happened since then, even if it's right at the end of the lesson. So I think sometimes in the midst of the lesson, it's difficult to think, but being able to see that through the observations, through the focus of the observers focusing on the case students, we can capture this information, we capture the nuances of learning, the nuances of students' engagement, and try to make some sense of that, try to infer what they've understood, what they've learned, or what are the barriers to their learning. Pedagogical content knowledge. This was one teacher, this was a male teacher. He said we basically started again with the maths curriculum. He said something about we ripped it up and started again. He didn't realize what he was doing was just ineffective in many ways, but the students weren't giving him that feedback. They were coasting along. They were sort of getting some of the grades they need to get. They were being assessed. They weren't doing as well as they possibly could have done, but he didn't know that. And it was only when they started to engage in lesson study and start to unpick it that he saw what was happening with the curriculum, the difficulties with the curriculum that they had. And the bottom quote was from a female teacher. I just think it's so powerful. She said, I didn't know what was happening in my own classroom. And I think that for any teacher, that's a little bit daunting, but it's very powerful, very powerful. So synthesis of knowledge, synthesis of input in order to co-construct new knowledge. So just a point on there, when they almost got into an argument, that was quite powerful, because what was happening is they were challenging each other, but they weren't wanting to back down, but having to back down because of the process. So they were really trying to commit to lesson study, but reverting back to their old sort of cultural selves, if you like, of needing to take charge, or needing to say, I know this, I'm knowledgeable in this area. And as a teacher, especially an experienced teacher, because some of these were very experienced, it's very exposing to have somebody challenge your ideas, especially if it's a novice teacher, because this is not what we're used to in our culture. So yeah, there can be some conflict with lesson study, but you really do have to go with it. You have to expose yourself in that way, and open up yourself to a little bit of risk, to challenge yourself and to try things out that you might not think worked, or at least to thrash those ideas out. So, like anything, it's not fantastic. It is fantastic. Sorry, it's not perfect. One of the limitations, it's very time consuming. You tie 3 teachers up together. It doesn't have to be 3 either, but that's just, it tends to be the model that we use. You tie teachers up together in a team. You bring in a university specialist, or you bring in another teacher, or you bring in other people. This is all very time consuming for lots of people who are committed to that. But very powerful and very rewarding if you speak to the people involved. Potentially costly, because who's covering those lessons whilst you're planning this one? So even though lesson study is not something you do every week, it might be, you might do 3 cycles per year, and that's one iteration, but it's still potentially costly because of the implications of what you have to do, tying those teachers up. Definitely requires collaboration, definitely requires the whole school approach. Senior management have to be on board. It can expose teachers, as I've already mentioned. Teachers can get quite aggressive about it, or very protective of their own teaching and their own experiences. For me, that's an experienced teacher becoming stagnant, and that's problematic. I think good teachers will always be open to development, always open to new ideas and strategies and advice. And it can be difficult to implement in teacher education. Mostly because if you're putting students into placements, if you try and do it on placements, that's very difficult, because then you've got all the logistics of it. I've got more experience of doing it in the university before they go out onto placements. For me, that works, and I can go through the model that we've used to show you how we did that. But that's quite effective, because you can keep control of that. Whereas once they're in placement, it's more difficult. Okay, and that's pretty much it for that. So I've left a bit of time for some questions, but I can also talk about how we've implemented it as well, if you want.
Well, thanks for that, Dave. That was really. I had no idea you were quite so idealistic. I've seen you in an entirely different light tonight. So thank you very much. So I've got kind of assuaged the question. I mean, it's not my area, but it's piqued a lot of interest.
Yeah.
So I've certainly got questions, but what I like to do is, rather than hijack it as chairing the session, is open it up and see if anybody else has got any questions at this point. So colleagues, ask away. What would you like to know?
It's always a bit of pressure, isn't it, that there are only 3 of you?
No. It did. It built up quite a bit. So.
David?
Yeah.
Rick here. How do you see the relationship between lesson study and dual role of mentors who would probably in ITE be taking part in the lesson study, as well as mentors and coaches, also their assessors at the end of the course? Do you see that might that interfere with the opening up and the process in the way that it should be done?
Yeah, I think if a mentor engages with the process, so if say 2 student teachers and a mentor decide to, or even 1 student teacher and 1 teacher and 1 mentor decide to engage in this process, it can, I suppose it can create some difficulties, but it's about going beyond that and saying, well, none of us are perfect. None of us are even as experienced as we are. None of us are, amazing teachers who will always be outstanding. We have always got something to learn. And I think for me, it would be more enlightening, if you like, if the mentor did become involved, because it shows the human side of them, but also shows that they are still developing teachers as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm interested in the reference you made to Kakler. I don't know if I said that right.
Cycler, it is.
Yeah, I can spell it. So
Yeah, his name. Yeah, his name is Vassal Cycler.
Right.
I only know that because I went to a conference. He was there, and somebody introduced him. And I looked around, and I looked at his name, and thought, that's how you say it.
Because I got quite heavily influenced by, I think, something he wrote with Wood in 2016 on lesson study, and that was calling for more literate use of the standards so that you could enable lesson study in the way that you're describing it.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, we've just got the new standards in FE, which I've only briefly looked at because we're not using them till next year because for continuity. But so are those standards you mean, the standards, or
Yeah.
and the teaching standards
and the teaching standards? Yeah. But they were just meaning any reductive description of competencies that goes into a list, I think, when in their paper.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm rolling this out. We've got it on our program. I'm rolling it out with other sectors. So for the primary, and we're in secondary and further education. I'm trying to roll it out to primary and early years. Also rolling it out to staff as well. So for HE members, for them to engage in their own practice. We've got a project going to start around how we could use lesson study to develop our practice. But also working with the medical team, so looking at trainee nurses and doctors, how they learn, because it's quite, medical education is quite big. I didn't realise actually, and they do use a lot of educational strategies, so we're rolling it out with them as well.
Yeah, I'll shut up after this one, but I can actually see that it wouldn't take too much in ITE programs to just tweak what we do already in terms of paired observations to involve more people and at an earlier stage in the observation process to include the planning. And it would be, we just observe a feedback at the moment after an observation, and it would be good if it was a proper lesson study style discussion afterwards.
Definitely,
having had everybody involved in the beginning as well. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.
Yeah, it definitely would be. We've done it, so I can speak from experience in that sense. Is that it was quite effective, and the students loved it. They loved to do something different, and we like to think of it as something innovative. Or Ofsted come in and we say, well, our research is underpinning our teaching, in that sense. My research is in lesson study as well, so in that sense, we are using what we found out to inform our practice. That's the theory. Whether it works, I don't know.
Right, a question for me, Dave. As I say, it's not my area, but I did encounter, albeit indirectly, I encountered Ofsted in the FE context, and kind of related to that, the very kind of command and control and managerialist and punitive culture that was developed by the hierarchy of management, who kind of decided that really they became the arbiters of standards and measurement, and anybody that didn't kind of fall in line with what they deemed was, good or excellent teaching, then they were kind of managed really quite savagely out of the organization, which was terrible culture. So how realistic is a kind of mentorship-based model such as this? How realistic is that it could be authentically implemented in kind of schools and colleges, i.e. institutions that are kind of regularly savaged by at least a threat of Ofsted?
I think it's very difficult. It is I won't sugarcoat it. It is very difficult to do anything like that in an institution where you really do need them on board. You really need them to have that culture of growth, intellectual growth, as opposed to been stifled and managerial approach, you know, and it's all about, let's say, it's all about the standards and their standards, and so it's very difficult. I think you know, I suppose it's that old way of get them to think it was their idea. But it is. I mean, I've seen it flop in, you know, institutions like that where you know, they've had some funding and they've rolled it out, and then they've gone, right, great, that money's gone, you know, back to work now. And it's such a shame. And I think it really needs that cultural shift, but that's very difficult to do. So maybe the idea is that the teachers themselves take it on board and try and keep filtering it, you know, those ideas up, or the success of it, if you like. But it is very difficult if we don't have that culture in the college, because you really do need them on board. You need to, and the other thing as well is because the teachers involved are probably a little bit more conditioned to be less reciprocal in their relationships and responsive and receptive to the challenging of ideas as well, because of the way they've been conditioned in the institution. So it's almost like you face numerous barriers when you've got a college like that.
So kind of related to that, which links into the kind of latter point that you made, because I think the best thing that you can do, which is something that we are really well accustomed to in universities, but less so in colleges, and I think probably especially so schools. I'm making an assumption there, but actually researching your own practice and cascading what is seen as, you know. So, are there any examples that you can kind of cite, or that you've encountered, of kind of research creation and dissemination within schools? Relating to teaching?
So obviously lots of action research projects and things. Is that what you mean? You mean sort of generating knowledge from within?
Yeah. I'm kind of sorry, just to kind of give that a little more context, because, you know, Ceres, you know, this is what you're kind of presenting as part of tonight. You know, so that creates a really effective infrastructure as part of not only Ceres but research centres and institutes. You know, it produces a body for academics and teachers to be part of, and to receive knowledge and cascade knowledge. I just, you know, I think, you know, within the kind of college and school sector, that might be something to sort of explore, maybe.
Yeah.
You know, kind of the creation, rather than, you know, so not necessarily every school having its own kind of centre for research or scholarship or whatever, but you know, maybe keep creating a kind of almost a confederation of a structure where a number of schools can come together and belong and subscribe to a structure, and it might just give them a vehicle to kind of build their confidence and provide a more formal focus for thinking about what they do well and how to cascade that.
Is this leading to the academies and to the trusts and to the those types of institutions? No, I guess so. With regards to research in schools, I think lots and lots of good practice goes on in schools and colleges, and I think it's you know, it's amazing to transforms their practice, transforms how they teach. But the problem is we don't define that as research. We don't identify it as research. It's not seen to be methodologically robust, and as I said before, it's seen to be a little bit insular, because you've devised these great strategies, or you've understood these students in a better way, and your teaching has improved. But how transferable is that? And I think that's the problem, is having that validation, if you like. But that's not as big of an issue in Japan because of the cultural differences, because those experiences are valued. So I think for me it would be getting around that. What is a research project, or what? It doesn't mean you can't make a contribution to knowledge, though, does it? Just because it's not research, but it's difficult. I think that's what it is, because you've still got the universities and seem to be in their ivory towers, and you've got the schools and colleges doing all the, you know, the practice, and, you know, never the twain meet, really, do they? The universities come in and do research on them and tell them how great they're doing or how bad they're doing, and, you know, and use them as subjects and stuff. And getting to that stage, which what I am trying to do, is to work more with teachers to say, you know, you do powerful stuff here, but let's look at validating it from our perspective, rather than controlling it and running it. Look at what it is that you do, but it is, for me, it is that line between what's research and what's just professional development. That's a difficult one.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Right, last 2 minutes. So any other colleagues with any questions, comments, observations, assertions? Judith?
Yeah, can I just, I don't know. I think I just have a comment and not a question, really. Thank you for the presentation. I wasn't really planning to come, so I thought my grandson is quiet, so I might jump in. So I'm glad I did. So because I haven't heard of lesson study before, so that's a good learning for me. One thing that came to mind when you're talking about pedagogical content knowledge is Schulman, which I'm bombarded with when I read articles from the United States. So that just came to mind, but obviously you weren't talking about Schulman. But I think the thing that kind of lingers in my mind as you talk and as we move into the conversation after your presentation is this focus on what do we see, who do we really focus on when we are in a lesson in a classroom. And I think the pressure, and I do not envy colleagues that were in IT or teachers in classrooms, the focus is the inspection, the standards, what ability is what grouping should we put this child, the content, the lesson. So the focus is always on something else and never really the children or the learners in front. So I think I like the idea of decentering and giving in this trio, they become your eyes, sort of to kind of relearn that. I think I like that. I like the idea of being able to see the students with these case studies, like a sort of, so there's layers to it, I find. And, just because also one of the things that circulates, and I just had a meeting with colleagues on decolonization. So I think it's a good way to shift, to really have this reaching out to children, as you said, and to listen to their voices and include their experiences now.
Yeah.
They experience them as part of that knowledge production that you're talking about, or construction, because at the moment we kind of have a pre-package, isn't it? Kind of knowledge that they have to kind of actually go through. So I think there is something quite exciting, though challenging in this lesson study. And I was just thinking, Craig, like in our, that you have this module, a project module. Would it be brilliant if we have some students who could be our eyes in some of our lessons? I think I don't think the argument will come after. The argument will be in the beginning. Because it's not easy to do. As I said, we are conditioned in specific ways. We know our movement within the class as soon as we enter it, the tone of our voice, the way you kind of project yourself. It's all written. And I think there is something about this that kind of invites you to kind of unmold and, change the habit of the conditions a little bit. It takes a lot of trust, though, which I think we're not very good at.
We're not. We don't like to be challenged. Well, it's part of our growth. Thank you. It's part of our growth, isn't it? And I think you're right. It's a little bit like going undercover, isn't it, in the classroom, sort of finding out what's going on that you don't see as a teacher, which is, is very powerful, isn't it? Because, as I say, you miss so much You have to filter things out. You know, if somebody shouts out a rude word and you just decide to ignore it, it's the equivalent of that, isn't it? Somebody does something and you ignore it, or somebody does something and you miss it and you shouldn't have ignored it, or you're concentrating on something else. And as beginning teachers as well, you're concentrating on your own sort of performance or your own sort of, you know, self. And I think we do that as well when Ofsted come in or senior management come in, viewers, you know, we're concentrating on what we're doing. And sometimes, I mean, I've done it when being observed, is I've forgotten what the students are doing because I'm too self-obsessed because I'm being observed, and I find it quite stressful. So yeah, it does, it captures all that. I think it helps to you know, to slow it down, slow that process down.
Right, brilliant. Well, time has gotten the better of us. So, kind of, many thanks for that, Dave. Really, you know, excellent. As Judy's mentioned, so I've learnt a lot there as well. It's fascinating, and it's really interesting to kind of discover that kind of practice taking place, you know, in relation to kind of, you know, schools and you know, potentially colleges, etc. So many thanks again. Really, very much appreciated.
You're welcome. I'm still blown away that Judith is a grandchild, by the way. You shocked me then. I didn't expect you to say you had a grandchild.
Well,
Yeah,
in relation to me.
Is that because I look too young?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. It's nice to meet you. I've met you on emails, I think. Richard,
Yes.
you know, we've
Yeah.
talked, but yeah, it's good to see you, Richard. I haven't seen you for ages as well.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
So I have to
Thank
get
you.
back to my grandson now. Okay, bye. Bye for
Thank you.
now.
Bye.
See you later.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Craig.